She stood there, stunned. A flight attendant's words had just cut through the air like a blade. "Wait at the back, girl." Passengers shifted uncomfortably, some pretending not to hear, others staring with that cold curiosity reserved for moments of quiet cruelty. The black girl's face didn't break. No tears, no argument. She just nodded, stepping aside, carrying the sting of those words in silence. But what no one knew, not the passengers, not even the attendant, was that within minutes, the same girl would not be waiting in the back at all. She'd be at the very front, in the cockpit, wearing the uniform of a pilot. And when the cabin doors closed, every assumption in that plane was about to be shattered. Her name was Alyssa Carter, 29 years old. Calm eyes, steady voice, the kind of presence that could quiet a storm. To the world outside, she was just another passenger boarding a flight. But beneath her blazer, tucked neatly inside her bag, was a pilot's cap, her badge of honor, her proof of a journey carved through years of doubt, sacrifice, and quiet rebellion. Alyssa had dreamed of flying since she was 6. Back then, she would stand in her backyard in Atlanta, tracing airplanes with her finger against the sky, whispering, "One day, that will be me." Her father, a mechanic who worked double shifts, used to smile and tell her, "Baby girl, you can fly as high as you want. Don't let anyone clip your wings." But Alyssa's wings had been tested. Flight school wasn't built for women like her. At least, not for a young black woman. The classrooms were filled with sharp glances, muttered jokes, and instructors who assumed was only there for diversity numbers. She remembered one classmate sneering, "You here to be a stewardess? Wrong program, sweetheart." Every time, she swallowed the sting, turned the doubt into fuel, and pushed harder. By the time she earned her pilot's license, Alyssa had flown more hours than most of her male peers. Yet the shadow of disbelief followed her everywhere. Airport security checked her ID more than others. Colleagues whispered when she walked past, and still, Alyssa carried herself with quiet defiance. Her uniform was not just clothing, it was armor. This flight was supposed to be routine. She wasn't scheduled to fly, she was simply repositioning, catching a ride back home after a long week of duty. She boarded early, blending with passengers, ticket in hand. To most, she looked like any young woman traveling alone. But the flight attendant at the boarding gate looked at her differently. The attendant's eyes lingered, scanning her up and down with that sharp mix of skepticism and dismissal that Alyssa knew too well. When Alyssa stepped onto the jet bridge, the attendant's voice followed. "Back of the plane, sweetheart. That's where you'll be waiting." Passengers behind Alyssa pretended not to notice, but their silence roared in her ears. It wasn't the words alone, it was the tone, the casual authority, the assumption that she didn't belong in the front rows, that her skin marked her place before her ticket did. Alyssa froze for a moment. Part of her wanted to reply, to show her boarding pass, to let the weight of her rank crash against the arrogance in that tone. But she didn't. Not yet. Instead, she offered a faint smile, stepped aside, and walked down the aisle. Her heart pounded, but her expression remained unreadable. She had learned long ago that silence could be sharper than any blade. She took her seat, blending into the cabin. The flight attendant strutted down the aisle moments later, checking bags, checking faces, checking her. Alyssa didn't flinch. She didn't look away. She just waited. Because Alyssa knew something the attendant didn't. Within minutes, when the final checks were done and the crew gathered, she wouldn't be just another passenger. She would be stepping into the cockpit. Her domain, her sanctuary, the space where her hands on the controls commanded the very skies. And when that moment came, the entire plane would see her not as the girl at the back, but as the captain who carried them forward. But for now, Alyssa sat quietly, letting the sting of those words settle, letting the silence build into something far heavier, something that was about to break wide open. The flight attendant's words might have faded in the noise of engines and chatter for anyone else. But for Alyssa, They lingered like smoke in the air, unshakable, suffocating. She had learned to live with moments like these, the little slights that stack upon each other until they weigh more than stone. But this one was fresh, raw. As the plane filled, passengers shuffled into their seats. A businessman with silver hair snapped his fingers impatiently at the same attendant, demanding overhead space. A family with 2 toddlers wrestled with seat belts, laughter and frustration tangled together. The cabin was a living theater of human behavior. But Alyssa felt eyes on her, curious, questioning, some sympathetic, some indifferent. It was the kind of silence that followed you, when people knew what they'd witnessed, but didn't dare to intervene. The attendant moved briskly, professional smile plastered on her face, as if nothing had happened. Yet her glances toward Alyssa carried something sharper, something dismissive. Alyssa recognized it instantly, the unspoken rule, the one that whispered, "Know your place." Her pulse throbbed, but Alyssa didn't shift in her seat. She kept her back straight, her gaze forward. She wasn't just waiting for the flight to begin. She was waiting for the moment to show exactly where her place truly was. Minutes ticked by. The captain's voice boomed through the intercom, welcoming passengers aboard. Relief swept across the cabin, routine settling in. But then came the call, the discreet signal only crew members recognized. Alyssa rose from her seat, smooth and steady, and walked toward the front. Whispers stirred immediately. Passengers turned heads, eyes narrowing. A murmur rippled. "Where's she going?" The attendant, spotting Alyssa in the aisle, stepped forward sharply. "Mom, passengers need to remain seated until..." Alyssa reached into her bag, pulled out the cap, and placed it neatly on her head. The uniform was invisible before, hidden in plain sight. Now it radiated authority. The transformation was instant, undeniable. Gasps echoed. A mother nudged her child to look. The businessman's smirk melted into surprise. The attendant froze. Her professional mask cracked, disbelief flooding her face. This was the same girl she told to wait at the back? The same one she dismissed with a wave of the hand. Alyssa didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. Her calm cut deeper. She simply looked the attendant in the eye, then past her, toward the cockpit door that was now opening. A fellow pilot leaned out, greeting her with respect. "Captain Carter, we're ready for you." The silence in the cabin wasn't silence anymore. It was thunder. Judgment hung in the air, but this time it wasn't on Alyssa. It was on the attendant, whose authority had just evaporated in front of 100 witnesses. Alyssa walked forward, steady and unflinching. The attendant stepped aside, her lips parting as if to speak but no words finding escape. The aisle felt endless, each step pounding louder than the last. Alyssa could feel the passengers' gazes burning into her, rewriting the narrative they'd been fed only minutes before. Because now they weren't looking at a girl at the back. They were looking at the one person trusted to command the skies. And for Alyssa, that transformation wasn't just personal. It was the echo of every moment she had been underestimated, dismissed, or doubted. Now the tables had turned, and the lesson was just beginning. The cockpit door closed behind Alyssa with a soft click, shutting out the murmurs of the cabin. Inside, the hum of instruments filled the air, a sound she knew better than her own heartbeat. Her co-pilot greeted her warmly, no hesitation, no doubt. To him, she wasn't a stranger or a passenger. She was the commanding officer, the one with final say. Yet even in this sanctuary, the sting of the flight attendant's words clung to her. "Wet at the back, girl?" They weren't just words. They were a reminder of every fight she had waged to sit in this very seat. Every barrier dressed as policy, every smirk dressed as joke, every time someone tried to ground her before she could take off. And now, she had a choice. She could let the insult pass quietly, as she had done 100 times before. She could focus on the flight, carry the passengers safely to their destination, and let the moment dissolve into memory. That would be the safe path, the professional path. But as Alyssa adjusted her headset, she thought of her father's voice, Don't let anyone clip your wings. She thought of the young girls, black, brown, forgotten, who might one day sit where she sat, whose dreams might die a little each time someone told them they didn't belong. And she thought of the eyes in the cabin, passengers who had seen the insult, seen her silence, and now saw her power. Silence wasn't enough anymore. The seatbelt sign chimed overhead. The attendant entered the cockpit with the pre-flight checklist, eyes down, hands trembling ever so slightly. Alyssa didn't raise her voice, didn't snap, didn't humiliate. Instead, she looked up calmly, and with the weight of command, spoke. Next time you see me board this plane, don't assume where I belong. Because I don't wait at the back, I lead from the front. The words landed heavier than turbulence. The attendant's face flushed crimson. Her lips pressed tight, as if she wanted to respond but couldn't. She nodded quickly, retreating into the cabin. Alyssa turned back to her instruments, her hands steady on the controls. But inside, a storm raged. Speaking up came with risk. Pilots, especially women of color, walked a razor's edge of scrutiny. A single complaint, a single misstep, and careers could crumble. Yet Alyssa knew this wasn't just about her. It was about the weight of example, the proof that silence can no longer shield prejudice. As the engines roared to life, and the plane began to roll down the runway, Alyssa's choice crystallized. This flight wasn't just about taking passengers from one city to another. It was about carrying a lesson into the sky, visible to everyone who had watched the story unfold. Because sometimes the breaking point isn't when the world tries to keep you down. It's when you finally decide you won't stay silent anymore. And as the plane lifted off, piercing through clouds into open blue, Alyssa knew she had chosen right. At 30,000 feet, the cabin was quiet, but beneath that quiet, tension still simmered. The passengers hadn't forgotten. The flight attendant certainly hadn't. And Alyssa, she was caught in the aftermath of her choice. From the cockpit, she could hear faint whispers when the door opened. Snatches of conversation carried forward. Did you see? Oh, she's the pilot? Unbelievable. Some voices sounded odd. Others doubtful, even irritated. Prejudice doesn't vanish in a single reveal, it shifts, it recalibrates. For some, Alyssa's presence in the cockpit was inspiring. For others, it was threatening. The attendant, once so composed, now moved stiffly through the aisles. Her professional polish was cracking. She could feel passengers' stares, could sense their judgment. Every smile she forced felt heavier. Every polite word felt like penance. She replayed her own voice in her head. Back of the plane. Sweetheart. What had seemed like harmless authority now rang like a confession she couldn't escape. Meanwhile, Alyssa's silence was its own thunder. She didn't broadcast her authority. She didn't announce herself over the intercom in triumph. She simply flew. Smooth, precise, steady. Her every movement on the controls was a declaration in itself. I belong here. I have always belonged here. But the consequences rippled beyond the cockpit. A young black girl sitting in row 12 kept stealing glances toward the front. She tugged on her mother's sleeve, whispering, "Mama, she's the pilot." Her mother's eyes softened, brimming with pride. Another passenger, a middle-aged man who had smirked when the attendant spoke earlier, now shifted uncomfortably, unable to meet Alyssa's gaze when she passed through the cabin during a brief check. Even the businessman in first class, so used to being catered to, sat in stunned silence. His worldview, carefully ordered, had been disrupted in a way he couldn't control. The weight of it all pressed on Alyssa's shoulders. Every turn of the yoke wasn't just guiding an aircraft. It was guiding perception, forcing people to confront the lie they'd been sold. That leadership, authority, brilliance came in only one color, one gender. And then came the turbulence. The plane jolted, sharp enough to send gasps through the cabin. Drinks spilled, seatbelts clicked tighter, prayers whispered. Alyssa's hands moved with practiced grace, steadying the aircraft, her voice calm and commanding over the intercom. Ladies and gentlemen, remain seated. We're passing through a rough patch, but everything is under control." Her composure was ironclad. The plane smoothed, the storm passed, and with it, something else broke too, the doubt. Passengers who had questioned, who had judged, who had whispered, now they sat in quiet respect. They had seen not just a black woman in uniform. They had seen a professional, a leader, someone who carried their safety in her hands, and did it flawlessly. The attendant, standing at the galley, felt the shift as well. The authority she once claimed had crumbled, and Alyssa's authority, earned, undeniable, now filled the cabin like oxygen. Consequences. They had arrived not in punishment but in revelation. Alyssa hadn't needed to shout, hadn't needed to shame. She had let her presence, her skill, and her dignity do the work. And now the cabin wasn't just a place of travel. It was a place where a painful truth had been exposed, and where respect had been rewritten in real time. But consequences cut both ways, because even as Alyssa proved her worth yet again, she knew the world outside this flight would still test her, still doubt her, still demand that she rise twice as high to be seen as equal. And the question remained, would this moment spark change, or simply fade into silence once the wheels touched ground? The descent began. The engines hummed softer, the lights in the cabin dimmed, and the familiar announcement came, "Ladies and gentlemen, we'll be landing shortly." For most flights, that moment signaled routine. But on this plane, something had shifted. The story of who Alyssa was, and where she belonged, had rewritten itself in the minds of everyone aboard. As the runway approached, Alyssa guided the jet with precision, her hands steady on the controls. Touchdown was smooth, seamless, exactly what every passenger prayed for but rarely acknowledged. The cabin erupted in polite applause, that universal relief after a safe landing. Yet this time, the clapping carried a different weight. Some passengers clapped harder, not just for the landing but for her. When the doors opened and passengers began to disembark, Alyssa stepped out of the cockpit. Normally, captains didn't stand in the aisle, they let that to attendants. But today she chose to. She stood tall, uniform crisp, cap gleaming, meeting each gaze as people filed past. The young black girl from row 12 stopped in her tracks, her eyes were wide, her smile brighter than the sun through the jet windows. "Mama, that's her!" "That's the pilot?" Alyssa bent slightly, meeting the girl at eye level. "One day, it could be you up there," she said softly, pointing back to the cockpit. The girl's eyes shimmered, her mother's hand tightening around hers with pride. Other passengers murmured thanks, some awkward, some genuine. A few avoided eye contact altogether, unwilling to face the mirror Alyssa had just held up to their assumptions. And then came the flight attendant. Her face was pale, her smile forced, her steps hesitant. For a moment, she looked as if she might keep walking, slip away into the stream of passengers. But she didn't. She stopped in front of Alyssa, words caught in her throat, finally barely audible. I didn't know." Alyssa's reply was calm, unshaken. "That's the problem. You assumed." She didn't linger, didn't scold further. The silence that followed said more than any lecture could. The attendant nodded quickly, swallowed hard, and moved on. As the cabin emptied, Alyssa stood alone for a moment, watching the last passengers leave. Her father's words echoed again, "Don't let anyone clip your wings." And today she hadn't. She had flown not just a plane but a truth that refused to be hidden at the back, because in that brief journey through the clouds, she had shown them all her place was not where prejudice tried to confine her. Her place was in the front, in command, leading the way forward, and as the terminal swallowed the departing passengers, Alyssa remained on board, cap in hand, heart steady, not triumphant, not bitter, just resolute, because she knew the fight wasn't over. But she also knew this: every flight, every moment, every challenge was another chance to break the sky open wider. Not just for herself, but for everyone told to wait at the back. In the end, what happened on that flight was more than one insult, more than one confrontation. It was a revelation. A flight attendant tried to confide a young black woman to the back, not realizing she belonged at the very front. In that moment, prejudice collided head-on with truth, and truth won. Alyssa didn't need to shout, didn't need revenge. She let her presence, her skill, and her quiet strength do the speaking. And in doing so, she carried more than passengers. She carried dignity. She carried possibility. She carried the weight of every child who dares to dream of a sky that doesn't question their place in it. The lesson is sharp and clear. Racism thrives on assumptions, but assumptions crumble when faced with undeniable reality. Every time someone like Alyssa steps forward, the lie loses power. Every time someone refuses to wait at the back, the path widens for those who follow. And so this story isn't just hers. It belongs to anyone who has been underestimated, dismissed, or told where they don't belong, only to prove, with grace and resilience, exactly where they do. This was her flight, her fight, her truth, and this is everyday racism drama,